Hello and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Dr. Philip McMillan, and I have been sharing about COVID 19 since March of 2020. My research has been focused on autoimmunity. That's an immune response that's overactive, causing severe COVID 19. And as a result, I have been looking for autoimmune responses. That's where the immune system recognizes the body as foreign as being the primary mechanism for causing severe disease and potentially complications around COVID 19. From that perspective, I've always looked at things from a different light. And when I read or heard recently that the WHO had declared that the pandemic was over, I did this. Really? Well, where did that come from? Now, I understand the desire for the pandemic to be over because most people are COVID weary. The only people who seem to focus on COVID 19 are researchers who are doing independent research like myself. So, where would this idea of the COVID pandemic being over have come from? Well, in order to corroborate the story, I took a look at the BBC News headlines, and they were sharing what was done by the WHO. And in it, they have highlighted that the global health emergency is over, according to the World Health Organization, and it is no longer a global health emergency. It's a major step towards ending the pandemic and comes 3 years after it was first declared the highest level of alert for the virus. So, their main reason seems to be that the officials have said the death rate from COVID 19 has dropped from a peak of more than 100,000 in January 2021 to just over 3,500 in April 24. Wonderful news. I guess we would be right. That means the pandemic is over. Well, one lesson that I have learned in the context of everything is that you need checks and balances. You need to be able to corroborate evidence. And as I had mentioned before, always is there needing to be an audit. Where are these facts actually coming from? One of the concerns I had in March of 2023 was the fact that one of the most important areas of being able to do checks and balances was taken offline. And that's to do with, of course, Johns Hopkins. So, Johns Hopkins has been sharing this information for quite a bit of time, and I'm going to go through it here with you. But they have been sharing important information with regards to the pandemic for over 3 years. And here you have it here. This is just the site. Johns Hopkins has stopped collecting data of the 10th of the 3rd, which is the 10th of March 2023, after 3 years of round the clock tracking of COVID 19 data. And at that point, you can see here the red means that there is circulating virus. Europe, America, Australia, Japan, South America. The only place that seems to have missed it was Africa. And so again, you could argue that, well, maybe it isn't a pandemic because Africa isn't really involved. So therefore, in some senses, they are right. But the Johns Hopkins University gave us some valuable trending data coming up to that March deadline when they can no longer track. Why are they no longer tracking? Because it clearly is no longer important to know the data. I wonder who made that decision. So here we go. Let's look at it again. And what we can see here is that this is talking about weekly cases of COVID 19. And you can see this wonderful downward trend with regards to it. At the peak here, this was in January of 2022. That would have been Omicron surging across the world. You have this trend down, and then it's come down to the lowest point here. In truth, you would have expected after Omicron, it should have ended like what happened in Africa about here. But for some reason, we still continue to have peaks. One of the strangest points is that nobody seems to be interested in why Omicron is circulating in highly vaccinated regions. I actually got censored for raising that point in April of 2022. It's still circulating. But guess what? We're no longer measuring it. So I guess it doesn't matter. Interestingly, when you look even in more details at Johns Hopkins, you can see here weekly deaths according to COVID 19. And again, it peaked in 2022. Well, it was here in 2021. Then it dropped off with Omicron because Omicron doesn't cause the same kind of disease. There was a big spike here. But generally, the deaths hadn't changed much from about May 2022. It had remained largely static. So, my question is, what has changed in the past 2 months that suddenly made these deaths drop off so that they are no longer relevant? We have no checks and balances. Is it just the way that they're counted? Is there another criteria that is used? What other reason could there be for no longer needing to look at the pandemic as being a global emergency? Well, the only other thing that seems to fit, and I can only presume, is we can see here that vaccination uptake has dropped to its lowest point. It's quite remarkable. Actually, if you look at it from a 28-day point of view, this is even more remarkable. Look at this. Actually, 28 days prior to Johns Hopkins stopping, cases were rising, deaths were rising, vaccinations were falling. This doesn't look like a situation where the pandemic is over. But who am I and who is Johns Hopkins to actually show data and facts? It doesn't matter these days, it seems. The important thing is that as far as it is being counted, we're now down to 3,500 deaths globally. My thought on the matter. Just remember this. Omicron is a different virus to the Alpha Delta Wuhan, primarily because of its entry mechanism. The research indicates that it will focus primarily in the central parts of the lung, the hilar regions, compared to Delta, which went all the way through and down into the peripheral parts of the lungs, causing very severe COVID-19. In this case, it's still causing severe inflammation, it's just in a different part of the lung. The mistake is to think that this is irrelevant. That is the point that I'm making. Additionally, from an autoimmune perspective, the big problem for the world with circulating virus is that potentially every time there's an infection, it reactivates the immune system in a way that can be detrimental. Now, no one seems to want to talk about this, but it is the most important piece of the puzzle in trying to anticipate what is coming in the months and the years ahead. My only warning and my only hope that people will take into consideration is that we need to understand what is driving excess mortality across the world. There is something that is connected with recent COVID infections. Even though people don't die immediately, it does seem from the Singapore data that within 3 months you have excess mortality in those who have been infected. We need to understand the mechanisms. The only way this can be done is through autopsy. But guess what? If the pandemic is over, who would be interested in looking at the pathology and trying to understand the disease? That's where I think we are at a very dangerous point in this so-called pandemic. Without further research, without further understanding, we are flying blind. And who is to tell what will happen in the future if we don't do the work now that has to be done? So let's hope they're right. But if they're not, keep following. I'll be able to predict what's going to happen next. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.